Chapter 6 of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 6 to 4. Perhaps to every person in that control room there came, as Chet's quiet, emotionless tones died away, the same mental picture, for there was the same dazed look on the countenances of all. They were seeing an ocean of space, an endless void of empty black, and across that etheric sea was a whirling globe. They had seen it from afar. They had seen its diminutive continents and its snow-clad poles. They would never see it again. Earth, their own world, home, and now for them it was only a moon, a tremendous, glorious moon, whose apparent nearness would be taunting and calling them each day and night of their lives. It was Diane Delacoeur who dared break the hard silence that bound them all. From wide eyes she stared at Walt Harkness, then her lips formed a trembling smile in which Chet too was included. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved us, Chet, but now it looks as if we all were exiles." She crossed slowly, walking like one in a dream, to stand close to Walt Harkness, and Chet Bullard also roused himself, but it was toward the stupefied, hulking figure of Schwartzmann that he moved. He reached for the detonite pistol, and this man, who had been their captor, was too stunned to make any resistance. Chet jammed the weapon under his belt. "Close that port," he ordered the two men who had half opened it at Schwartzmann's command. "Keep that poison gas out." There was a flash of color that swept by the open port, some flying creature of vivid crimson. Chet had no time to see what manner of bird or beast it was, but it was alive. He crossed to examine the spectro analyzer, and the two men disregarded his order and slipped into the rear cabin. "Seems all clear to me, Walt," he said quickly, and Harkness confirmed his findings with a quick glance. "Okay," he assured Chet. "The air is all right to breathe." He glanced from a lookout port. "The air's moving now," he said. "That gas, whatever it was, is gone. It must have settled down here in the night. Some new vent that has opened since we were here before. But suppose we forget that and settle matters in here," he suggested, and Chet nodded assent. "Call your men," Harkness ordered Schwartzmann. The man had recovered his composure. Again his heavy face was flushed beneath a stubble of beard. He made no move to comply with Harkness' demand. But there was no need. From the cabin at the rear came the scientist Kreiss. His face was pale and drawn, and he stared long and searchingly at Chet Bullard. His breath still whistled in his throat. The poison gas had nearly done for him. At his heels were the two who had been working at the port. Two others who had held Harkness were drawn off at one side, where they mumbled one to another and shot ugly glances toward Chet. This, Chet knew, accounted for all. Even the pilot, Max, had roused from the sleep that a blow on the chin had induced and was again on his feet. For him, no explanation was needed. The shattered cage of the ball control told its own story. Harkness seated Mademoiselle Delacoeur on a bench at the pilot's post. "You will want to be in on this," he told her, "but I'll put you here in case they get rough. But don't worry," he added, "we'll be ready for them now." Then he turned to Schwartzmann. "Now you. Oh, there are plenty of things I could call you, and you would understand them perfectly, though they are all words that no gentleman would use." At Schwartzmann's outburst of profane rejoinder, Harkness broke in with no uncertain tones. "Shut up, Schwartzmann, and stay that way. I'm giving the orders now, and we'll just cut out all the pleasantries. They won't get us anywhere. We must face the situation, all of us, see what we're up against, and make some plans." But Herr Schwartzmann was not to be put down so easily. He crossed over to where Chet stood. Chet's hand dropped to the pistol that was hooked in his own belt, but Schwartzmann made no move toward it. Instead, he planted himself before the pilot and jammed his fists into his hips while he tried to draw his stocky form to equal Chet's slim height. "Fool," he said. "Dolt! For a minute I believed you. I thought you had cut us off from the Earth. Now I know better. Max, he understands ships, and the Herr Doktor Kreiss is a man of science. Together they the repairs will make." The master pilot smiled grimly. "Try to do it," he said, and turned toward the two whom Schwartzmann had named. "You, Max, and you too, Dr. Kreiss. Do you want to take on the job? If you do, I will help you." But the two looked at the shattered controls and shook their heads at their employer. "Impossible!" the pilot exclaimed. "Without new parts it can never be done." Schwartzmann seemed about to vent his fury upon the man who dared give such a report, but Dr. Kreiss raised a restraining hand. "Check," he said. "I checked that report. Repairs are out of the question." Chet caught Harkness' eye upon him. "I'll be back," Harkness told him, and went quickly toward the rear of the ship. Their stores were back there. Would Walt think to get a detonite pistol? He came back into the room while the thought was still in Chet's mind. A gun was in each hand. He passed one of the weapons to Diane. Unconsciously, Schwartzmann felt for his own gun that was in Chet's belt. He laughed mirthlessly. "Two men," he said scornfully. "Two men and a girl." Harkness paid no attention. "Now we will get right down to cases," he remarked. "Two men and a girl is right, plus what is left of one ship. And please don't forget that the ship is ours, and all the supplies that are in it. Now you listen to me. I've a few things to tell you." He faced squarely toward Schwartzmann, and Chet had to repress a grin at the steely glint in his companion's eyes. "Nice chap, Harkness. Nice, easy-going sort, up to a certain point." Chet had seen him in action before. "First of all," Harkness was saying, "don't think that we have any illusions about you. You're a killer, and like all such, you're a coward. If you had the upper hand, you would never give us a chance for our lives. In fact, you were ready to throw us out to be gassed when Chet raised your little bet. But it looks as if Chet and Mademoiselle Delacoeur and I will have to be living on this world for some time. We don't want to start that life by killing off even such as you. Not in cold blood. We will give you a chance. We will split our provisions with you, give you half of what we have. You will have to shift for yourselves when that is gone. We all will have to learn to do that." Again the heavy, glowering face of Schwartzmann broke into a laugh that was half sneer. "You're damned kind," he told Harkness, "and, as usual, a fool. Two men and a girl." He half turned to count his own forces. "There are 7 of us," he challenged. 7, and all of them armed, all but me." He spoke a curt order in his own tongue, and each man whipped a pistol from his clothes. 7 to 2, he said, and laughed again. "Maybe it is that Herr Harkness would like to count them." "Your ship and your supplies," he exclaimed scornfully. "And you would be so kind as to give us food." "Gott in Himmel!" he shouted. "I'll show you. I'm talking now. We stay here, ja, because this Dummkopf has the controls gebroken. But it is we who stay, and you go, because I say so. It is I who rule, and I prove it. 7 to 2. 3, a firm voice spoke from between Chet and Harkness. 7 to 3. Our odds are improving, Herr Schwartzmann." And Chet saw from the corner of his eye that the gun in the small hand of Mademoiselle Diane was entirely unwavering. But he spoke to her sharply, and his voice merged with that of Harkness, who was saying somewhat the same words. "Back, go back, Diane. We can handle this. For God's sake, keep out. We don't want any shooting." Neither of the men had drawn his gun. Their hands were ready, but each one had hoped to end this weird conference without firing a shot. Here was no place for gunplay and for wounded men. Their attention was on Diane for the moment. A growled word from their enemy brought their minds back to him. They turned to find black pistol muzzles staring each of them in the eyes. Herr Schwartzmann, in the language of an earlier day, had got the drop. 7-3, Schwartzmann said. Let it go that way. No difference does it make. If I say one word, you die. Chet's arm ached to snap his hand toward his gun. It would be his last move, he well knew. He was sick with chagrin to see how easily they had been trapped. Walt had tried to play fair with a man who had not an atom of fairness in his character. And now... 7-3, Schwartzmann was gloating, till another voice broke in. I don't check your figures. The whistling tones were coming from a tortured throat, but the words were clear and distinct. I don't check you. I make it 6-4. And if one of your men makes a move, Herr Schwartzmann, I shall blow you to a pulp. And Herr Dr. Kreiss held a gun in a steady hand as he moved a pace nearer to Chet, a gun whose slender barrel made a glinting line of light toward Schwartzmann's eyes. If the gentleman and mademoiselle will permit, he offered almost diffidently, I would prefer to be aligned with them. We are citizens of another world now. My former allegiance to Herr Schwartzmann is ended. This is, what is it you say, a new deal. I would like to see it, and I use another of your American aphorisms, I would like to see it a square deal. The voice of a scholar, thought Chet, one more used to the precision of laboratory phrases than to wild talk like this, but no man to be trifled with nevertheless. Chet did not hesitate to turn despite the pistols that were still aimed at him. But Herr Kreiss was not looking in his direction. His eyes were trained steadily in the same line as his gun. This little experiment he was conducting seemed to require his undivided attention until the end. To Schwartzmann he said sharply, "Your men, order them to drop their weapons, quick." As they clattered upon the floor, the scientist turned and extended his hand to Chet. And still speaking not too technically, he continued, "This is one hell of a fix that you have got us into. Even in desperate straits it took nerve to do that." He pointed to the shattered remains of the multiple bars that had been the control mechanism, and added, "I admire that kind of nerve. And if you don't mind, since we are exiles together..." His throat seemed choking him again. There were weapons in the hands of Chet and Harkness. They were not making the same mistake twice. Chet shifted his gun to his left hand that he might reach toward the scientist with his right. "I knew you were white all the time," Chet told him. "I'll say you belong." End of chapter 6. Of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Red Swarm. It was a matter of a half hour later when Harkness ordered them all outside. He had accepted Kreiss as an addition to their ranks and had made himself plain to Schwartzmann. To the scientist he said, "You remarked that no ship could hold two command pilots. That goes for an expedition like this, too. I am in command. If you will take orders, we will be mighty glad to have you with us." And to Schwartzmann, in a different tone, "I am sparing you and your men. I ought to shoot you down, but I won't. And I don't expect you to understand why. Any decency such as that would be beyond you. But I am letting you live. This world is big enough to hold us both, and pretty soon I will tell you what part of it you can live in. And then remember this one thing, Schwartzmann. Get this straight. You keep out of my way. I will show you a valley where you and your men can stay. And if you ever leave that valley, I will hunt you down as I would one of the beasts that you will see in this world." Chet had to repress a little smile that was twitching at his lips. It always amused him hugely to see Harkness when roused. "Turn us out to starve?" Schwartzmann was demanding. "You would do that?" "There will be food there," said Harkness curtly. Suit yourself about starving. Only stay where I put you." Back of the others of Schwartzmann's men, the pilot, Max, was stooping. Half hidden, he moved toward the doorway to the rear cabin and to the storage room and gun rooms beyond. Chet glimpsed him in his silent retreat. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Max," he advised quietly. "Personally, I think you're all getting off too well. As for myself, I'm sort of itching for an excuse to let off this gun." It was here that Harkness turned to the open port. "Put them out," he snapped. "You, Chet, go out first and line them up as they come. But no, wait. There may be gas out there." Chet was beside the port. A breath from outside came to him sweetly fragrant. A shadow was moving across the smooth lava rock. A bird, he thought. Then a flash of red in startling vividness swept past the open door. It was like a quick flicker of living flame. He could not see what it was, but it was alive, and this answered his question. "Send 'em along," he said. "It seems all right now." He stepped through the opening in the heavily insulated walls. It was early morning, yet the sun was already hot upon the smooth expanse of the lava flow. Some ancient eruption from the distant peaks that hemmed in the valley had sent out this flood of molten rock. It was hard and black now. But to the right, where the valley went on and up, and rose gently and widened as it rose, a myriad of red flames and jets of steam told of the inner fires that still raged. These were the fumaroles where only a month before he and Harkness and Diane had found clustering savages who were more apes than men. They had been roasting meat at these flames. And below, where the lava stopped, was the open glade where the little stream splashed and sparkled. In the high rock walls that hemmed the glade, the caves showed black. And beyond the open ground was the weird forest where tree trunks of ghostly white were laced with a network of red veining. They grew close, those spectral columns, in a shadow world beneath the high roof of the greenery they supported. Here was the scene of an earlier adventure. Chet was swept up in the flood of recollections born of familiar sights and scents. Herr Schwartzmann, cursing steadily in a guttural tongue, came from the ship to bring Chet's thoughts back to the more immediate problem. There were 5 others who followed, the pilot and Schwartzmann's 4 men. There had been another, but his body lay huddled upon the bare lava. He had followed his master far, and here, for him, was the end. Kreiss' pistol was still in his hand as he came after. Harkness and Diane were last. Harkness pointed with his gun. "Over there," he ordered. "Get them away from the ship, Chet. Line them up down below there. All the ape-men have cleared out since we had our last fight. Get them down by the stream. Diane and I will bring them some supplies, and then we can send them off for good." Chet sent Kreiss down first, where an easy slope made the descent a simple matter. It had been the bow wave of the molten lava. Here was the end of that inundation of another age, and the slope was wrinkled and creased. Schwartzmann followed, then the others. The last man was ready to descend when Diane and Walt came back. They had packages of compressed food. This was all right with Chet, but he raised his eyebrows inquiringly at the sight of several boxes of ammunition and an extra gun. Harkness smiled good-naturedly. "I will give them 1 pistol," Walt told him, "and a good supply of shells. We don't need to be afraid of them with only 1 gun, and we can't leave the poor devils at the mercy of every wild beast." "You're the boss," said Chet briefly, "but for me, I'd sooner give this Schwartzmann just 1 bullet right where it would do the most good." "Let's make him work for it," he suggested, and called to the men below. "Come back up here, Schwartzmann. A little present for you, and I'm saying you don't deserve it." He watched the return trip as Schwartzmann dragged his heavy bulk up the slope. He was enjoying the man's explosive, panted curses. Beside him were Diane and Walt. With them it was as it had been with him at first. They had eyes only for the familiar ground below, the stream, the open ground, the trees. Each of them was looking down at that lower ground. It was Kreiss standing down there who first caught Chet's attention. Kreiss was trying to shout. Chet saw his waving arms. He stared, puzzled, at the facial contortions, the working lips from which no sound came. He knew that something was wrong. It was a moment or two before he realized that Kreiss could not speak, that the throat, injured by the choking fumes, had failed him. Then he heard the strangled croak that Kreiss forced from his lips. "Behind you! Look behind you!" Schwartzmann was scrambling to the top where they stood. Every man was accounted for. What had they to fear? And suddenly it was borne in upon Chet's consciousness that he had been hearing a sound that was louder now, a rustling, a clashing of dry, rasping things. The very air seemed to hold something ominous. He knew this in the instant while he whirled about, while he heard the dry rustling change to a humming roar, while he saw, like a cloud of flame, a great swarm of red, flying things like the one that had flown past the port, and one, swifter than the rest, that darted from the swarm and flashed upon him. It was red, vividly, dazzlingly red. The body of a reptile, a wild phantasm of distorted dreams, was supported by short, quivering wings. The body was some 5 feet in length, and it was translucent. A shell, like the dried husk of some creature long dead, yet here was something alive, as its quick attack proved. It had a head of dry scales which ended in a projecting, black-tipped beak that came like a sword, straight and true for Chet's heart. It seemed an age before he could bring his pistol up and fire. Detonite, as everyone knows, does not explode on impact. The cap of fulminate in the end of each bullet sets it off. But even this requires some resistance, something more than a dry, red husk to check the bullet's flight. There was no explosion from the tiny shell that Chet's pistol fired, but the bullet did its work. The creature fell plunging to the rocky ground, and its transparent wings sent flurries of dust where they beat upon the ground. There were others that went down, for the bullet had gone on and through the great swarm. And then they attacked. The very fury of the assault saved the huddle of humans. So close were the red things pressed together that their vibrating wings beat and locked the swarm into a mass. They were almost above their prey. Chet knew that he was firing upward into the swarm, but the sound of his pistol was lost. The red cloud hung poised in a whirling maelstrom, and the pandemonium of clashing wings whipped down to them not only the sound of their dry scraping, but a stench from those reptile bodies that was overpowering. Sickly sweet, the taste of it was in Chet's mouth. The sound of the furious swarm was battering at his ears as he knew that his pistol was empty. There were red bodies on the bare rocks before him. A scaly, scabrous thing was pressing against his upflung hands that he raised above his head. A loathsome touch. A beak that was a needle-pointed tube stabbed at his shoulder. Before he could flinch aside, the quick pain of it was piercingly sharp. Other red horrors dropped from the main mass overhead. He saw Harkness beating at them wildly while he made a shelter of his body above the crouched figure of Diane. 2 of them, 2 incredible, beastly flying things. He saw them so plainly where they hovered, and Harkness striking at them with a useless empty gun while they waited to drive home their lance-like beaks. The picture was so plain. His brain was a photographic plate, supersensitized by the utter horror of the moment. While the red monster stabbed its beak into his shoulder, while he drove home one blow against its parchment body with his empty pistol, while the wild, beating wings lifted the creature again into the air. He saw it all. Here were Diane and Harkness. Nearby, Schwartzmann was on the ground. His man, the one who had not yet descended with the others, was running stumblingly forward. He was wounded, and the blood was streaming from his back. Chet saw the two monsters hovering above Harkness's head. He saw their thick-lidded eyes, and he saw those eyes as they detected an easier prey. The fleeing man was half stooped in a shambling run. The winged reptile Chet had beaten off joined the other two, and they were upon the wounded man in a flurry of red. Chet saw him go down and took one involuntary step forward to give him aid, then stopped, transfixed by what he beheld. The man was crouching down in terror. Above him the three monstrous things beat each other with their wings. Then their long beaks stabbed downward. The man's body was hidden, but through those transparent beaks there mounted swiftly a red stream. Plainly visible, Chet saw that vital current, that living life-blood of a living man drawn into those beastly bodies. He saw it spread through a network of canals, and he was held rigid with horror until a harsh scream from Harkness reached his brain. "The trees!" Harkness was shouting. "The trees! Down, Chet! For God's sake, you can't save him!" Walt was half carrying Diane. Even then Chet was vaguely thankful that their bodies were between the girl and this gruesome sight. And Walt was leaping madly down the lava slope. Beyond him, already on the lower level, was the racing figure of Schwartzmann. A whirling flash of red pursued him. Another made a crimson streak through the air toward Walt's back. Chet came with startling abruptness from the frozen rigidity that held him, and he crashed his empty pistol in a well-directed aim through the body of the beast. Then he, too, threw himself in great leaps down the slope. Kreiss was firing from below. Chet knew dimly that this was checking the attack of the swarm. He saw Walt stagger, saw blood flowing from a slash on the back of his head, and knew that Kreiss had got the monster just in time. He sprang toward the stumbling man and got his arms under the unconscious figure of the girl to help carry the load. And now it was Kreiss who was shouting, "The trees! We'll be safe in the trees!" He saw Kreiss drop his pistol and dash headlong for the white trunks of ghostly trees. His arm was pierced by a stinging pain. Cold eyes with thick leathery lids were staring into Chet's as he cast one horrified glance over his shoulder. Then he crashed against the white trunk of a tree and helped Harkness drag the body of the girl between the two twin trunks. He pulled himself to safety in the shelter of the protecting trees and held weakly to one of them. And the crimson lacework of the sapwood that showed through the white bark was no brighter red than the mark of his blood-stained hands where they clung for support. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doomed. The sun was high when they ventured forth. Diane would have come, but the two men would have none of it. They remembered the sight they had seen. They knew what was left of the man's body, lying on the rocks above, and they ordered the girl to stay hidden while Kreiss remained with her as a guard. There were only the four who lay hidden in the woods. Schwartzmann and Max, with the remaining three men, were gone. Harkness's calls were unanswered, and he ceased the hello. "Better keep quiet," he advised himself and the others. "We are out of ammunition, though they don't know it. And they have got away. They will keep on going, too. I am not any too well pleased with that. I wanted to put Schwartzmann where I could keep an eye on him. Oh, well, he isn't very dangerous." But Chet Bullard made a few mental and unspoken reservations to that remark. That boy is always dangerous, he told himself, and he won't be happy unless he is making trouble. Thank the Lord, he hasn't got that gun. He came out cautiously from among the trees, but the red horde was gone. The reptile's wings had rasped and clashed furiously for a time. They had darted in fiery flashes before the protecting trees, and the fitful breeze had brought gusts of nauseous odors, until a thin haze formed in the higher air and the red things were gone. "There will not be any more for a while," said Harkness. He pointed toward the fumerole they had seen from the lookout earlier in the day. Again it was emitting jets of thin, steamy vapor that did not disappear like steam, but floated up above their heads. "The gas has driven them off," he added. The two men climbed slowly up the slope that had been the wave front of molten rock. Chet found his pistol by the path and picked it up. "We'll get more ammunition up top," he told Harkness, "and we will toss some down to Kreiss. He can have the extra gun you brought for Schwartzmann, too." He stopped suddenly. He had reached the level top of the lava flow. Here was where they had stood when the beasts attacked, where Harkness had dropped the boxes of ammunition and the pistol. And except for a few scattered bodies of unbelievable reptiles, and for a stain of blood where his own wound had bled, there was nothing to show where they had been. "He got him!" Chet exclaimed. "That son of a gun! Schwartzmann got the gun and shells. I saw him scrambling around on the rock. I thought he was just scared to death, but no, he wasn't too frightened to grab the gun and the ammunition while one of his own men was being killed. And that's not so good either." A dozen paces beyond was a huddle of clothing that stirred idly in the breeze. "The poor devil!" exclaimed Chet, and moved over beside the body of the man who had gone down under the red swarm's attack. It lay face down. Chet stooped to turn the body over, though he knew there was no hope of life. He stopped with a gasp of dismay. Two eyes still stared in horror from a face that was colorless, a drained, ghastly white face. No tint remained to show that this ever had been a living man. More dreadful than the waxen pallor of death, here was a bleached, bloodless flesh that told of the nameless horror that had overwhelmed this man, beaten him down, and drained him of every drop of blood. "Vampires," Chet heard Harkness saying in a horrified whisper. "Those beaks were like tubes, and they " He stopped as if in fear of the words that would tell what they themselves had escaped. Chet turned the body to its former position. That dreadful face beneath the pitiless sun was a sight no other eyes should see. "Let's go on to the ship," he said. "We'll get some ammunition. Go back and get Diane." He did not finish the thought. Before him he saw the lifeless body moving. It rolled and shuddered as if life had returned to this thing where no life should be. Chet raised one hand in an unconscious gesture as if to ward off some new horror that the body might disclose. It was a moment before he realized that the rock was shaking beneath his feet, that he was dizzy, and that from no great distance a rumbling growl was sounding in his ears. The moving body had shaken Chet's mental poise as had the earthquake his physical equilibrium. Harkness had not seen it. He was looking off across the level plateau. "Look!" he exclaimed. "Another vent has opened. See it spout?" Some 100 yards distant were clouds of green vapor that rolled into the air. At their base a fountain of mud sputtered and spouted and fell back to build up a cone. The green cloud whirled sluggishly, and then was caught by the breeze and began its slow, rolling progress across the flat rock. It was coming their way, rolling down toward the ship, and Chet gripped suddenly at his companion's arm. "Come on," he said. "I'm going away from here, and I'm going now. We'll get Diane and Kreiss. Remember what a whiff of gas did to him this morning?" He was drawing Harkness toward the face of the rock. He wondered at his slowness. Walt seemed fascinated by the oncoming cloud. "Wait!" Harkness paused at the top of the descending slope. Chet turned to look where Harkness was watching. The green cloud moved slowly. As he turned to stare, it touched the bow of their ship. It flowed slowly, sluggishly along the sides, and then swept up and over the top. The lookouts of the control room were obscured, and the port from which they had come. "Cut off," breathed Harkness, his voice heavy with hopeless conviction. "We can't get back, and now we're on our own past any doubt." "It may not last," Chet was urging an hour later, when with Kreiss and Diane they stood on high ground to look down on the ship. The sparkling sheen of the metal cylinder had changed from silver to pale green. The cloud that enveloped it was not heavy, but it was always the same. Yet still Chet insisted it may not last. "Sorry to disappoint you," replied Kreiss, "but there is little ground for such a belief." Again he was the professor, instructing a class. "These fumaroles, in my opinion, are venting a region far below the surface. It is possible that further seismic disturbances may alter conditions. A rearrangement of the lower rock strata may close existing crevices and open others like this you have seen. But, barring that, I see no reason for thinking that this emission of what appears to be chlorine with other gases may not continue indefinitely." Chet looked at Diane. It was a twinkle that appeared and vanished in her eyes as Herr Professor Kreiss concluded his remarks. She would laugh in the very face of death, Chet realized, but her tone was entirely serious as she offered another suggestion. "If this wind should change," she said, "and if it blew the gas in another direction, the ship could be cleared. One of us could go in long enough to switch on the air generators full." But now it was Chet who shook his head in a negative. "Remember," he told her, "when we were here before, all of the time while Walt was gone for the ship, how did the wind blow then?" "The same as now," she admitted. "And it never changed?" "No," slowly, "it never changed." Chet turned to Walt and Kreiss. "That's that," he said shortly. "Any other good ideas in the crowd? Can anyone go through that gas and get to the ship? I'll make a try." "Suicide," was Kreiss's verdict, and Harkness confirmed his words. "I saw things that moved up in the trees," he said. "Lord knows what they were, birds, beasts of some sort, but they were alive till the gas touched them. I saw it drift among the trees when we left, and those things up there came plopping down like ripe apples." Diane Delacouer looked up at Harkness with wide, serious eyes. Then she shrugged. "We are really "Castaways," Harkness told her. "We're on our own, off on a desert island, shipwrecked, all that sort of thing. And you might as well know the worst of it, you too, Kreiss. Our good friend Schwartzmann is at large, and he has the pistol and ammunition we brought out from the ship. He is armed, and we are not. He has food, and we have none. And I'll have to admit that I didn't have any breakfast and could use a little right now." "There are 7 shells left in my pistol," said Diane. She held the weapon out to Harkness. He took it carefully. "7," he said, "is all we have. We must kill some animals for food, my dear, but not with these. We must save these for bigger game." "But we cannot," expostulated Kreiss. "To kill game with our bare hands impossible. We are doomed." And now Chet caught Diane's glance brimming with mirth that was undisguised. Truly, Diane Delacouer would have her laugh in the face of death. "Doomed!" she exclaimed. "Not while Chet and I know how to make bows and arrows. Do you suppose we can find any of their old spears, Chet? They made gorgeous bows, you remember." And Chet bowed low in an exaggeration of admiration that was not entirely assumed. "Lead on," he said. "You are in command. The army is ready to follow." Chapter 8. Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Premonition. Fire Valley had been the home of the ape-men. On that earlier journey, Walt and Chet had seen them, had fought with the tribe, and had lived for a time in their caves that made dark shadows high on the rock wall. And they knew well that the wood the ape-men used for their spears was well suited for bows. Back in the caves they found discarded spears and some wood that had been gathered for shafts. Tough, springy, flexible, it was a simple matter for the men to convert these into serviceable weapons. Sinews that the ape-men had torn from great beasts made the bowstrings, and there were other slim shafts that they notched, then sharpened in the fire. Yet to Chet as he worked came an overwhelming feeling of despondency. To be fashioning crude weapons like these, preparing to defend themselves as best they could from the dangers of this new, raw world? No, it could not be true. And he knew while he protested that it was all in vain. He asked himself a score of times if his impulsive, desperate act had not been a horrible mistake. And he found the same answer always. It was all he could have done. Had he attacked Schwartzmann, he would have been killed, and Walt too. Schwartzmann would have had Diane. Only some such stupefying shock as the effect of the shattered control could have checked Schwartzmann. No, there had been no alternative, and the thing was done, finally, irrevocably done. Chet walked to the cave mouth to stare down at the ship below him in the valley. From the fumarole's throat came a steady, rolling cloud of shimmering green. The ship was immersed in it. The voice of Herr Kreiss spoke to him. The scientist, too, had come forward for another look. "If it were at the bottom of the sea," he said, "it would be no more inaccessible. It is, in very fact, at the bottom of a sea of gas. We could penetrate an aqueous medium more easily." And, Chet pondered slowly, if only I could have returned. With time and metal bars and tools that I could improvise, I might... His voice trailed off. What use now to speculate on what he might have done? The scientist concluded his thought. "You might have reconstructed the control, yes. I, too, had thought of that. But now the gas. No, we must put that out of our minds, unless we would become insane." Chet turned back into the black and odorous cave. He saw Harkness, who was flexing a bow he was making for Diane. He was showing her how to grip it and let the arrow run free. "Towahg was the last one I instructed," Walt was saying, and Chet knew from the deep lines in his face that his attempt at casual talk was for Diane's benefit. I wonder how long Towahg remembered. He was a grateful little animal. "Towahg?" queried Kreiss. "Who is Towahg?" "Ape-man," Harkness told him. "Friendly little rascal. He helped us out when we were here before. He saved Diane's life, no question about that. I showed him the use of the bow, jumped him ahead 100 generations in the art of self-defense." "And offense," was Kreiss's comment. "There are certain drawbacks to arming a potential enemy." "Oh, Towahg is all right," Harkness reassured the scientist, "although he may have taught the trick to others of the tribe who are not so friendly." "Where are they? In what direction do they live?" Kreiss continued. "Want to make a social call?" Chet inquired. "You needn't mind those little formalities up here, Doctor." But in the mental make-up of Herr Dr. Kreiss had been included no trace of humor. He took Chet's remark at face value, and he answered in words that echoed Chet's real thoughts and that took the smile from his lips. "But no," said Herr Kreiss, "it is the contrary that I desire. Here we are, here we stay for the rest of our lives. I would wish those years to be undisturbed. I have no wish to quarrel with what primitive inhabitants this globe may hold. There is much to study, to learn. I shall pass the years so." "And now," he questioned, "where is it that we go? Where shall be our home?" Chet, too, looked inquiringly at Harkness. "You saw more of this country than I did," he reminded him. "What would you suggest?" At the sight of the serious, troubled eyes of Diane Delacouer, he added: "We want a site for high grade subdivision, you understand? Something good, something exclusive, where we can keep out the less desirable element. Dianeville must appeal to the people who rate socially." At the puzzled look on the scientist's face, Chet caught Diane's glance of unspoken amusement, and he knew that his ruse had succeeded. He must not let Diane get too serious. Harkness answered slowly: "I saw a valley. I think I can find it again. When Towahg guided me back to the ship, when we were here before, I saw the valley beyond the third range of hills. We go up Fire Valley, follow the stream that comes in from the side." "Water?" Chet questioned. "Yes, I saw a lake." "Cover? Trees? Not the man-eating ones?" "Everything. Open ground, hills, woods. It looked good to me then. It will look a lot better now," said Walt enthusiastically. "Walk faster," said Chet. "I'm stepping on your heels." They reached the valley floor some distance above the fumerole and the clouds of poison gas, and the march began. The attack of the flying reptiles had taught them the danger of exposure in the open, and they kept close to the trees that fringed the valley. Once Chet left them and vanished among the trees, to return with the body of an animal slung over one shoulder. "Moon pig," he told the others. "Ask Dr. Kreiss if you want to know its species and ancestry and such things. All I know is that it has got hams, and I'm going to roast a slice or so before we start." "Bow and arrow?" asked Harkness. Chet nodded. "I'm a dead shot," he admitted, "up to a range of 10 feet. This thing with the funny face stood still for me, so it looks as if we won't starve." The sun had swung rapidly into the sky. It was now overhead. One half of their first short day was gone, and Chet's suggestion of food met with approval. "I can't quite get used to it," Diane admitted to the rest. "To think that for us time has turned back. We have been dropped into a new and savage world, and we must do as the savages of our world did thousands of years ago. Now, in 1973." Chet removed a slab of meat from the hot throat of a tiny fumerole. "1973 on Earth," he agreed, "but not here. This is about 19,000 B.C." He called to Kreiss, who was digging into a thin stratum of rock. The scientist had a splinter of flint in his hand, and he was gouging at a red outcropping layer. "All John Q. Neanderthal himself," said Chet. "What have you found? Silver or gold? Whatever it is, you're forgetting to eat. Better come along." But Dr. Kreiss had turned geologist, it was plain. "Cinnabar," he said. "An ore of hydrargyrum." His tone was excited, but Chet refused to have his mind turned from practical things. "Is it good to eat?" he demanded. "Nein, nein," Kreiss protested. "It is what you call mercury, quicksilver." "Ladies and gentlemen," said Chet dryly, "I see where this man Kreiss is going to be a big help. He has discovered the site for the thermometer factory. He will be organizing a chamber of commerce next." He left out a portion of the cooked meat for Kreiss's later attention, and he and Harkness rolled a supply into leaf-wrapped packages and stowed them in the pockets of their coats before they started out. Again the little procession took up the march with Harkness leading. "Leave as little trail as possible," Harkness ordered. "We don't want to shout to Schwartzmann where we have gone." They left the valley of the fires to follow the stream bed in another hollow between great hills. Chet found himself looking back at the familiar flares with regret. Here was the only place on this new world which was not utterly strange to his eyes. He continued to glance behind him. long after the smoky fires were lost to sight, but he would not admit even to himself that it was for another reason. 1973, and he was a man of the modern civilization. Yet deep within him there stirred ancient instincts, racial memories perhaps. And as he splashed through the little stream and bent to make his way through strange leafed vines and leprous spotted trees, a warning voice spoke inaudibly within his own mind, spoke as if it might have whispered to some ancestor scores of centuries dead. "You are followed," it told him. "Listen, there is one who follows on the trail." End of chapter 9. Of Brood of the Dark Moon by Charles Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Mysterious Rescuer. Their way led through tangled growths of trees and vines that were like unreal things of a dream. Unreal they were, too, in their strange degree of livingness, for there were snaky tendrils that drew back as if in fear at their approach, and stalks that folded great thorny leaves protectingly about pulpy centers at the first touch of a hand. The world of vegetation seemed strangely sentient and aware of their approach. Only the leprous white trees remained motionless. Their red-veined trunks towered high in air, and the sun of late afternoon shot slantingly through a leafy roof overhead. Twice Chet let the others go on ahead while he slipped silently into some rocky concealment and watched with staring, anxious eyes back along their trail. But the little stream's gurgling whisper was the only voice, and in all the weird jungle there was no movement but for the unfolding of the vegetation where they had passed. "Nerves," he reproached himself. "You're getting jumpy, and that won't do." But once more he let the others climb on while he stepped quickly behind a projecting rock over which he could look. Again there was silence. Again the leaves unfolded their thorny wrappings while vermiform tendrils crept across the ground or reached tentatively into the air. And then, while the silence was unbroken, while no evidence came through his feeble human senses, something approached. Neither sight nor sound betrayed it, this something that came noiselessly after. But a telltale plant whipped its leaves into their former wrapping. A vine drew its hanging clusters of flowers sharply into the air. The unseeing watchers of the forest had sensed what was unheard and unseen, and Chet knew that his own inner warning had been true. He waited to see this mysterious pursuer come into view, and after waiting in vain, he realized the folly of thinking himself concealed. He glanced about him. Every plant was drawn tightly upon itself. With silent voices they were proclaiming his hiding place, warning this other to wait, telling him that someone was hidden here. Chet's face, despite his apprehension, drew into a whimsical, silent grin. "No chance to ambush him, whoever he is or whatever it is," he told himself. "But that works two ways. He can't jump us when we're prepared, not in daylight anyway." And he asked himself a question he could not answer. "I wonder," he whispered softly, "I wonder what these plants will do at night." Almost they could see the swift descent of the sun. Each flashing glint of light through the dense growth came from lower down toward the invisible horizon. It shone at last where Chet cast anxious glances about upon a mound of rocks. Rough blocks of tremendous size had been left here from some seismic disturbance. Like the ruins of a castle, they were heaped high in the air. Even the tree growths stopped at their base, and above them was an opening in the roof of tangled branches and leaves, a rough circle of clear blue sky. "How about making camp?" Chet asked. "This place looks good to me. I would just as soon be up off the ground a bit." Harkness looked at the pile of rocks, glanced once toward the sun. "Right," he agreed. "This will do for our first camp." "You've named it," Chet told him as he scrambled to the top of the great block. He extended a hand to Diane, standing tired and breathless at its side. "Welcome to first camp," he told her. "Take this elevator for the first 10 floors." He drew her up to the top of the block. Harkness joined them, and Diane, though she tried to smile in response to Chet, did not refuse their help in making the ascent. The day's experiences had told on all of them. 30 or 40 feet above the ground was Chet's estimate. From the top of their little fort they watched the shadows of night sweep swiftly down. Scrub tree growths whose roots had anchored among the rocks gave them shelter, while vines and mosses softened the hard outlines of the labyrinth of stones. Chet undid the package of meat and passed it out freely. There had been scurryings and rustlings in the jungle growth that had reassured him in the matter of food. Darkness fell as they ate, then it gave way to a new flood of light. Golden light from a monstrous moon. It sent searching fingers through the rifts in the leafy roof, then poured itself over the edge of the opening above in a cascade of glory. And though each one of the four raised his eyes toward that distant globe and knew it for the earth, no word was said. They ate their food in silence while the silent night wrapped them about. Still in silence they prepared for the night. Chet and Harkness improvised a bed for Diane in the shelter of a sheer rising rock. They tore off pieces of moss and stripped leaves from the climbing vines to make a mattress for her, then withdrew with Kreiss to a short distance while Chet told them of his suspicions. 6 hours of night, he said at last. That means 2 hours for each of us. We'll take turns standing guard. Harkness insisted on being first. Chet flipped a coin with Kreiss and drew the last turn of guard duty. He stretched himself out on a bit of ground where vegetation had gained a foothold among the rocks. "It's going to take me a while to get used to these short days," he said. 6 hours of daylight, 6 hours of night. This is a funny little world, but it's the only one we've got. The night air was softly warm. The day had been hard on muscles and nerves. Chet stared toward the glorious ball of light that was their moon. There were men and women there who were going about their normal affairs. Ships were roaring through the air at their appointed levels. Their pilots were checking their courses, laughing, joking. Chet resolutely withdrew his eyes. Think? Hell no. That was one thing that he must not do. He threw one arm across his eyes to shut out the light that brought visions of a world he would never see again, that emphasized the utter hopelessness of their position. His next conscious sensation was of his shoulder being shaken, while the hushed voice of Dr. Kreiss said, "Your turn now, Herr Bullard. 4 hours have you slept." From Kreiss, Chet took the pistol with its 7 precious shells. "All quiet," Kreiss told him as he prepared to take Chet's place on the soft leaves. "Strange flying things have I seen, but they do not come near. And of your mysterious pursuer we have seen nothing. You imagined it, perhaps." "I might have imagined it," Chet answered, "but don't try to tell me that the plants did. I'll give this vegetation credit for some damned uncanny powers, but not for imagination. I draw the line there." He looked toward the highest point of rock and shook his head. "Too plain a target if I'm up there," he argued, and took up his position in the shadows instead. Once he moved cautiously toward the place they had prepared for Diane. She was breathing softly and regularly, and on the rock at her side, with only his jacket for a bed, lay Harkness. Their hands were clasped, and Chet knew that the girl slept peacefully in the assurance of that touch. "They don't make 'em any finer," he was telling himself, and at the same moment he stiffened abruptly to attention. Something was moving. Through and above the hushed noises of the night had come a gliding sound. It was an indescribable sound, too elusive for identification, and Chet, in the next instant could not be sure of its reality. He did not call, but swung alertly back on guard and slipped from shadow to shadow as he made his way across the welter of rocks. He stopped at last in strained listening to the silent night. One hand upon a great stone block at his side steadied his body in tense, poised concentration. From afar came a whistling note whose thin keenness was mingled with a squeal of fright. Some marauder of the night had found its prey. From the leafy canopy above him voices whispered as the night wind set a myriad leaves in motion. The thousand tiny sounds that blend to make the silence of the dark. These he heard, and nothing more, while he forced himself to listen beyond them. He followed with his eyes the creeping flood of earthlight that came slantingly now through the opening above to half illumine this rocky world, and then, in the far margin of that light, he found something on which his eyes focused sharply, something that moved. Walt, Kreiss, he must arouse them. A shout of alarm was in his throat, a shout that was never uttered, for from the darkness at his back, not where this moving thing had been disclosed by the friendly earth light, but from the place he had just left, came a scream of pure terror. It was the shocking scream of a person roused from sleep in utter fright, and the voice was that of Diane. "Walter!" she cried. "Walt!" There were other words that ended in a strangling, choking sound, while a hoarse shout from Harkness merged into a discord that rang horribly through the still night. Chet was racing across the rocks. The pistol was in his hand. What fearful thing would he face? What was it that had attacked? He forced his leaden feet to carry him on in a succession of wild leaps. Forgotten was the menace behind him, although he half saw, half sensed a shadow that moved faster than he along the upper rocks. He thought only of the unknown horror that was ahead, that had drawn that despairing shriek from the brave lips of Diane. The few seconds of his crossing were an age in length. One last spring, one vivid instant, while the earthlight marked in sharp distinctiveness the figure of a leaping man. It was Harkness, throwing himself into the air, trying vainly to reach the struggling form of Diane Delacouer. She was held high above his head, and she was wrapped in the coils of a monster serpent, coils that finished in a smoothly rounded end, and Chet knew in that instant of horror that the thing was headless. He was raising his pistol to fire. The long moments that seemed never to end were in actuality an instant. Where should he aim? He must not injure Diane. From the high rocks beside him came a glint of light, a straight line of reflected brilliance as from a poised and slender shaft. It moved. It flashed downward. It hissed angrily as it passed close to Chet's head. It went on, a spear like a flash of light, on and down, to drive sharply into the body of that serpent shape, and the coils at that blow relaxed, while the figure of Diane Delacouer fell limply to the outstretched, cushioning arms of the man below. Had the weapon been thrown with uncanny accuracy, or had it been meant for him? Chet could not be sure, but he knew that before him Walt Harkness was bending protectingly above the unconscious figure of a girl, while above and about the two there flailed a terrible, headless thing that beat the rocks with sledge-hammer blows. It struck Harkness once and sent him staggering, and once it came close to Chet, so that his hands closed upon it for an instant. And with the touch he knew that this serpent was no animal shape, but worse, a creeping tendril from some flesh-eating horror of the vegetable world. He dashed in beside Walt. He saw Kreiss hurrying across the rocks. They had Diane safely out of reach of the thrashing, striking thing before the scientist arrived. The spear that had passed close to Chet had pinned this deadly thing to earth. It tore loose as they watched, and the wounded tendril, with the spear still hanging from its side, slid swiftly down the slope and into the darkness at the foot of the rocks. Even the calm preciseness of Herr Kreiss was shattered by the attack. In a confusion of words he stammered questions that went unanswered. Chet thrust his pistol into Harkness' hands and was off down the rocky slope toward the springs where they had got water for their evening meal. A rolled leaf made a cup that he held carefully while he climbed back. A few minutes later the pallid face of Diane showed a faint flush while she drew a choking breath. Harkness held the girl's head in his arms. He was uttering words of endearment that were mingled with vicious curses for the thing that had escaped. "Never mind that," argued Chet. "That one won't bother us again, and after this we will be on guard. But here is something to wonder about. What about this spear? Where did it come from?" Harkness had eyes only for Diane's tremulous smile. "I'm all right, truly," she assured him. Only then did he turn in bewilderment to Chet. "I thought you threw it. But of course not. You couldn't. We didn't have any spears." "No," said Chet. "I didn't throw it. I saw something moving across over there." He pointed toward the farther rocks where he had been. "I was going to call when Diane's scream beat me to it. But what I saw wasn't the thing that attacked her. And if it was the same one who threw that spear, he must have come across here in a hurry. And that spear, by the way, came uncomfortably close to my head. I'm not at all sure but it was meant for me." Harkness released his arm from Diane, for she was now able to sit erect. He picked up the crude bow that had been beside him and fitted an arrow to the string. "I'll go and have a look," he promised grimly, but Chet held him back. "You're not thinking straight. This shock has knocked you out of control. If that little stranger with the spear meant to help us, there's no need of hunting him out. He doesn't seem anxious to show himself. And if he meant it for me, he's still too good a shot to fool with in the dark. You stick here until daylight." "That is good advice," Herr Kreiss agreed. "The night, it will soon be gone." He was looking at the leafy opening overhead where the golden light of a distant earth was fading before the glow of approaching day. End of chapter 10.